Yesterday, we had the opportunity to be visited by Dr. Robert H. Molenbrock. Paul had never met Dr. Molenbrock. Paul has met this person. Paul did his PhD at Penn State University under Dr. Carl Keener. Dr. Keener's been retired for a while. I asked if he might write a little statement about Paul, and so I'm going to read that note, but first I'll let you know that he addressed it to Mr. Bill McKibben. So, dated 22 March 2022. Dear Bill, on behalf of Dr. Paul Rothrock, it is my pleasure to help celebrate the occasion of Paul's outstanding contributions to the flora of Indiana, with particular emphasis on the Sedge family Cyperaceae. Paul was a graduate student in the 1970s, and I should state at once, he was a model student, sharp, focused, with an uncommon eye for detail, and willing to work hard to achieve his goals. However, Paul's work in the Cyperaceae may not have occurred had it not been for a strange turn of events. When Paul began his doctoral research, he was planning to study the Ranunculaceous hispidus complex. However, after getting started, we discovered that Tom Duncan of Michigan was already at work on the same complex. Herb Wagner did not think it was a problem to have another doctoral student working in the same group. Paul and I discussed the approach, but we believed that Paul should work on some other group. I knew that Carex in Pennsylvania was ripe for a thorough treatment, and Paul accordingly went to work and produced a very fine study that was later incorporated into Roads and Blocks, the Plants of Pennsylvania. But Paul did not stop at that. Carex was a genus tailor-made for Paul, meticulous scholarship. Not only did Paul thoroughly master the complexities of the sedges of Pennsylvania and Indiana, he was an exemplary photographer as well. The beautiful illustrations in Paul's two books attest to his skills. His photos are exquisite, and his keys are first-rate. There is no doubt that Paul's work has set a superb standard for treating a complex genus. His two books on the sedges of Indiana are a benchmark for future studies in this complex family. His studies in Carex began some 50 years ago, have borne much fruit. Indeed, any future study of Carex, at least with respect to central United States, will of necessity go through Paul's studies. Absolutely. I'm eager to read his studies of Carex treated in the latest book and refresh my knowledge, much less than Paul's, of the Carex species I identified over the years. Finally, let me state that Paul stands in the distinguished line of brilliant field botanists who were able to transmit their observation to scholarly books of remarkable clarity. As such, Asa Gray is Paul's academic fourth great-grandfather. So Paul, my heartiest congratulations on producing two scholarly books that without doubt will greatly enhance our knowledge of the biology of a complex and wonderful family with special recognition of Carex. Kudos to you. Warmest regards, sincerely, Carl Keener. Where's Paul? Yours, buddy. Okay, I'm particularly fond of Carex as an ornamental. It gets underplayed, has great value in the landscape. Paul and I agreed. I suggested as much to Paul. It was not in the original draft. I said, Paul, it would really be kind of interesting if we put something with cultivation. Of course, Paul jumped right to it. It seemed appropriate that we should follow up on that discussion in the book with a discussion today on the attributes of Carex in the landscape. Towards that end, we thought it a wise decision to ask Kevin Tungesvick, who has a great deal of experience with the group, to lead the discussion today. Kevin.
Thank you, Bill. Just a little bit of background on how I got here as far as propagating and using sedges ornamentally. So in 1995, I had a history of working in the nursery industry through college, even though my degree is unrelated to that. And in 1995, I was hired by a nursery to develop a line of native plants. And among those, I immediately started with some Carex species. So and that started a 22-year saga where I managed a Spence restoration nursery up in Muncie, Indiana, and propagated nearly 170 species of native plants, about 30 of which were in the genus Carex. So I did and of course, a lot of that was driven, we were mainly a wholesale nursery, so a lot of that Carex was driven by wetland mitigation and stormwater practices. So the largest volume of sedges I tended to sell were wetland species, but I've always had a special affection for a lot of the woodland species and recognized their ornamental potential for ground covers and mass plantings. So that's where I'm going to head with a lot of this presentation is showing you a lot of different woodland sedges. And so we're going to dive right in. And what I'm going to do is show you a lot of the slides of the sedges that I think have worthy attributes for cultivation, but I'm going to leave plenty of time at the end for some discussion on other species, because I tried to only include species that I have good familiarity with, but there are others as well that people in this room probably like and have experience cultivating as well. So I've left hopefully a good 20-25 minutes for discussion at the end. Cool, so opportunities. So sedges, obviously, as everyone in this room knows, are a significant portion of our native flora and our most diverse genus of native plants, but are relatively rarely found in retail nurseries. And there are many sedges that address challenging landscape situations like wet areas or dry shade or poor sandy soil, or areas with varying hydrology like rain gardens. And they're excellent for erosion control. If any of you have really worked with sedges, you know they have, like grasses, have a very dense network of fine fibrous roots. So they're really good for soil stabilization and applications that involve soil stabilization. And many species are evergreen or semi-evergreen, so there's really a long season of interest. But unfortunately, sedges are poorly known by the public and not distinguished by grasses by many members of the public. And when they are available at nurseries, they are often ignored because of this lack of public awareness, and they may be fairly subdued compared to the more showy things that you typically see in nurseries. And while some have showy persistent inflorescences, they're mostly a foliage plant. So we've got that to look at. And native species are always going to be green or bluish green, and they may not have the colors that pop at a garden center that really grab people's attention, even though they have magnificent textures and foliage. And while some wetland species can recruit from seed fairly readily in a landscape situation, most woodland species are pretty difficult to direct seed. That means all the species in a garden or in a landscape setting have to be installed as live plants. And if you're doing a very large mass planting, that can be fairly expensive and labor intensive. So now you've all seen artificial groups of sedges and keys. This is perhaps the most artificial groups that you'll ever see here. So, but I found it kind of convenient to lump these into these groups with similar foliage characteristics. So we have broadleaf evergreen or semi-evergreen woodland sedges, fine textured woodland sedges, fine textured wetland sedges, forested wetland sedges with showy inflorescences, and rhizomatous wetland sedges. I did try to redeem myself by putting the section name for each species at the top of the slide, so you can at least relate it to Paul's book. So broadleaf woodland sedges, these are great ground covers. Most of them are native to rich woods, and they have evergreen or semi-evergreen foliage, and most flower in very early spring. And it's the sterile shoots that often come out a little later that have the really broad foliage. The flowering culms often emerge first, and then the sterile shoots emerge slightly later. So here in the photo, you can see Carex albertina, and you'll see those flowering shoots emerge and elongate first, and then you can see the sterile shoot at the base just starting to come into fruition. So the first section, or the first species, Carex plantaginea. In Indiana, this is usually on non-calcareous rich sites. There's a lot of it on very steep sandstone or siltstone exposures. If you've been to Turkey Run or Shade State Park, this is a characteristic sedge of those slopes there. So it's associated with that. You got great, beautiful purple leaf bases and very, very elongate inflorescences, and it flowers very, very early. But you can see how evergreen the foliage is. The foliage from last year in that photo looks so fresh and beautiful still. So this is a plant with wonderful winter interest. And then there's Carex cariana, which is what I consider the calcareous equivalent of plantaginea. So this is in really rich calcareous sites. I'm from the glacial till plain of east central Indiana, and this is a really characteristic sedge of our rich mesic woods. This is so in woods that haven't been beat up by grazing or past land use, this is an abundant sedge in our rich calcareous woods. And because of that, it's often associated with some of the richest spring wildflower displays as well. But like plantaginea, has purple leaf bases. It flowers a little later than plantaginea and has abundant strappy foliage that emerges again after the flowering culms. And like I mentioned, its habitat is quite replete with spring ephemerals. You can see the purple bases in the one slide, the inflorescence with the strongly triangular paragynia on the far right, I guess, the way you're looking at it. And you can also see the habitat with all the geranium and phlox, and the Carex cariana is visible on the left side of that slide. And so Carex laxiflora is another one in this group. And this is a variable sedge that may probably need some taxonomic work. So the ones that I feel have the real ornamental potential is the really broadleaf form. So there's a form with relatively narrow sterile shoots and a form with pretty broad leaves. And the broadleaf is the one with the really good ornamental potential. And again, this is a conservative species of mesic woods, doesn't necessarily require as rich a sites as cariana, and it's found in most states east of the Mississippi River, so it has a pretty wide distribution. And closely related is Carex albertina with even broader sterile shoots, and this has the diagnostic kind of spoon-shaped bract over the end of the inflorescence. And another one that I really, really think it has a great deal of landscape interest, but this probably has the broadest leaves of any of our native woodland sedges. And then unrelated to the previous species we've been covering in the section granulares is Carex granularis. And this isn't necessarily a woodland sedge. This grows in a wide variety. It has a wide ecological amplitude. It occurs in a variety of usually calcareous habitats. We saw it on a roadside yesterday at Trevlack Bluffs, but we also see it in fens, but we see it in at the edge of mesic woods, and it's in pretty disturbed places on my own property. But it makes a nice mass planting, and because of its adaptability to sun and shade, is a really great one as a ground cover. And then moving on to the next fake group, we have the fine textured woodland sedges, and these are great for mass planting. There are both rhizomatous and cespitose species, and it's important to make sure you're matching the species to the moisture and soil type, because I'll cover different species that are better for different applications or different site conditions. And that's Carex pennsylvanica, you can see in the slide there. So I apologize, I ran around in April trying to get as many pictures as I can, and most of them I was fairly happy with. This one not so much. I only found one clump of Carex albicans at the site I went to, so I had to work with it. But so albicans is a nice, really fine textured cespitose species, and it has a nice spray of inflorescences early in the spring. So it can make really attractive clumps. So I apologize, this picture doesn't quite do it justice. But if you look very closely, you can see some Sedum tornatum, another great native ground cover growing in at the base of the plant. So this is obviously a photo from the wild. But here's one that's already, this is one of the few sedges that's already very commercially available, Carex pennsylvanica, or common oak sedge. And this is native and very abundant in our oak woodlands and oak savannas, especially in Indiana and especially in the glaciated part of the state. It is in the southern part of the state, but more sporadically. And it will tolerate full sun, but it's best in dappled shade. It doesn't like really dense shade. And a great ground cover, and it's rhizomatous, so you can plug it on more distant centers and it fills in to fill a great ground cover. And because it's a poor seed producer and the seeds are somewhat difficult to germinate in many cases, this one's usually propagated vegetatively in the nursery trade, because it's not easy to obtain the numbers of seeds and to get the germination you need to propagate it in numbers. So here's Carex pennsylvanica in a landscape bed with daylilies, and you can see it's thriving in this full sun situation between a sidewalk and a curb. And there's a good close-up of the inflorescence. You can see there's relatively few seeds per inflorescence, and I was speaking with John Hoffman, who's here with the nursery, and they're selling hundreds of thousands of these. So you can imagine trying to collect hundreds of thousands of seeds and germinate it, and that's why it's being propagated vegetatively. This is a real favorite of mine, Carex jamesii. This is really common in mesic woods. It's a cespitose species, but makes a really attractive clump. And you can see last year's foliage, so it's very evergreen. It has a very inconspicuous inflorescence with only 2 or 3 perigynia, or 3 or 4 maybe at most. But it's a great substitute for the overused liriope in the landscape, because it has that kind of clump growing texture and a similar foliage. And it's quite adaptable to a lot of mesic shady sites. So this is a really great species for that clumpy appearance. And this one I'm not advocating so much for the landscape, but I want to make sure that everyone on their field trip tried to see this species, because Bloomington is kind of the centroid of the existence of this species in Indiana, at least. So Carex timida, we found it at Trevlack Bluffs yesterday, but you can see here, this is a large stand of it just at Griffey Lake Nature Preserve, which is just like 5 miles north of here. But you can see the little picture comparing it with Jamesii at the bottom of the left with the long staminate spike with many scales on Jamesii and the very short staminate spike on Timida with relatively few scales and often one large scale covering the end of the inflorescence. So hopefully everyone will get to see this one when you're in the area, because it is very common in this area. So moving on to other species, this is another one that's really grows a lot with Carex cariana in our rich woods in central Indiana. Carex woodii is a beautiful sedge. So you can kind of compare it to Pennsylvanica, and it's taller than Pennsylvanica, a slightly broader leaf, and it occurs in more rich mesic situations, whereas Pennsylvanica is usually in dry mesic to dry woods. So this is a beautiful sedge. This picture is from Eagle Creek Park in Indianapolis. This one is underrepresented. It reproduces primarily by rhizomes, so it's a poor flowerer, so it doesn't produce a lot of seed heads, and therefore there are relatively few collections of it. So it's vastly underrepresented in collections for how common I see it in central Indiana. It's in almost every very rich intact woodland that I find in the Tipton, what we call the Tipton Till Plain in this part of the state. Straight-styled wood sedge. So there's the sister species, curly-styled wood sedge, which is Carex rosea, and straight-styled wood sedge, which is Carex radiata. And obviously, besides the differences in the styles, the rosea tends to grow in more upland situations, the radiata in more damp woods, and sometimes even pretty wet woods. So straight-styled wood sedge is one woodland sedge that I sold quite a bit of at the nursery because it does make a really nice fine carpet. And you can see this was taken in the greenhouse at the nursery. You can see some celandine poppies on the right in bloom there, and sandwiched between that and another graminoid, there's the Carex radiata, we've got pretty good traction selling this one as an ornamental, and it will tend to flop in an ornamental situation after flowering, but then sends out a fresh clump of foliage. And here's one we saw yesterday, Carex communis, another one in often with Carex laxiflora or Carex woodii up in our part of the state, but it occurs in usually well-drained, often sloping woodlands. It's a very early flowering, so the perigynia are already falling off this down here. And it has red bases, except for the clump we found yesterday, which was really weird. But it typically has good red bases, but just a really attractive, graceful clump-forming sedge. And moving on to artificial group number 3, the fine-textured woodland sedges. So these are our cesspitoe species that thrive in damp to wet soils. Most species will grow fairly well in moist upland sites as long as the soil moisture is fairly consistent. And these are some of our really attractive species for use in the landscape. So I really like this one, Carex bromoides. For those of you who have been to bean blossom bottoms, it's a common sedge there. And occurs in swamps, as you see it in bean blossom bottoms, but seepage areas and also in wet flatwoods in Indiana. And I think the growth habit resembles Sporobolus heterolepis. It has that really graceful, big, full foliage clump. So and I've seen this used in the landscape in just fairly mesic conditions, and it seemed to be doing really well. So it seems to adapt. As long as there's fairly consistent moisture, it doesn't have to be terribly wet. But here's some pictures of it in bloom, which is probably just past to anthesis now, but these were taken a couple weeks ago in a restored wetland in Indianapolis, and you can see a beautiful spray of inflorescence followed by that really nice foliage. So this is one that I really think has great ornamental potential. And this one is one that's pretty widespread in the nursery trade already. Carex muskingamensis, swamp oval sedge. So this is one of the ovales and probably the most distinct species in that group. And so this has the very long, unfortunately I don't have a picture of the seed head, but it has the very long pointed seed heads. And in Indiana, where I see it is either in flatwoods depressions in our glacial till plain or in overflow sloughs and along slow-moving rivers in areas usually where there's temporary standing water in the spring. It has dark green foliage and those, like I mentioned, those pointed seed heads. And this does just fine in cultivation in moist upland sites, so it's not picky about being wet. And it's often marketed under the name palm sedge because the foliage tends to cluster at the top of the culm, resembling a little palm tree. This one I found growing up in the wet sandy areas in northwestern Indiana, the yellow fox sedge, Carex annectans, variety Xanthocarpa. And this one I like because, well, in the key, it keys out that the inflorescences exceed the leaves. And that's what makes the seed heads really showy, is they stick well above the leaves. So this is what it looks like in June. So it flowers typically in May, just a little ahead of Carex vulpinoidea. And then it just gets this dense spray of bright yellow seed heads. And it does well. It's a practical one too, because it comes from sandy wetlands that dry out in the summer. It's a great one for those bioengineered soil mixes they use in rain gardens and bioretention basins. It really does well in that well-drained engineered soil mix that gets flooded during storm events. And of course, good old Carex vulpinoidea, a workhorse in a lot of habitats, an early successional sedge and one of our most common wetland sedges, but the seed heads of this are really quite attractive, and it recruits. This is one that will recruit well from seed because I've seen it seeded in a lot of wetland projects, and it comes very easily from seed, and it produces abundant seed as well, so it's a really, really easy one to grow, which makes sense given its ecology as an early successional species. And of course, Carex stricta. Now this one forms the dense clumps that eventually help form the hummocks, which I think Laura will expand on the formation of those maybe a little bit with her talk on ants. And but this is a beautiful sedge, and there's nothing prettier than a sedge meadow in early spring when those bluish green shoots are emerging. And here you can see the inflorescences. This picture was taken about 2 weeks ago in central Indiana. And just a gorgeous sedge, very characteristic of our fens in the glaciated part of the state, and grows in generally saturated soil. It is cespitose, but it also produces long rhizomes, so it will spread by rhizomes somewhat as well. And great for pond edges or other saturated habitats. And this is actually a restored fen at Eagle Creek Park in Indianapolis that was actually in cultivation like probably 3 or 4 decades ago. And they came in and removed all the tiles and put in a whole bunch of plugs, and it looks remarkably well. Not only does it have this beautiful stand of Carex stricta, but it's got a great stand of pretty conservative fen plants such as Queen of the Prairie and lots of other goodies are in there. So that was a really gratifying project that I've been involved with since the 1990s. And thousands of plugs went into this restoration, but it was a really gratifying result. So next artificial group, wetland sedges with ornamental seed heads. So here we have these, I think we've seen several of these species on the field trips, and we'll see several of them at bean blossom bottoms, including, I was looking at some samples that Scott brought this morning, some mystery ones. But this is Carex gray eye on the picture. but these have large inflated perigynia and that persist. So these have some sedge culms, the seeds ripen, dihease, and they're gone. This is has a very long season of interest. So it's flowering now, and these mace-like seed heads don't break apart till September or October. So they're there all summer, providing landscape interest. And this is a forested wetland sedge usually, but it does great in mesic conditions. I have it in my yard in mesic conditions, and it thrives in those conditions and is even self-sown. But in Indiana, we'll see it in two primary habitats: in our floodplain forests and low depressions, but also in the glacial till plain in our upland flatwoods, where it grows with Carex lupulina and muskingamensis and bromoides and some of those others that grow in these wet flatwoods depressions. But great for damp, shady gardens. And this is one sedge I remember from my childhood, because we had this on the property where I grew up. And I was initially, as a little kid, I was afraid to touch it because it looks spiky. It looks like it would hurt you, but they're actually the perigynia are obviously very soft, and this is a great sedge for kids because they can whack each other with it and they won't hurt anybody. And then there's Carex lupulina with a more elongate and somewhat ascending perigynia. So this is also in the same habitat, but sometimes a little bit wetter than Carex grayi, and excellent for water gardens. This one I'd keep in pretty damp locations because it probably likes a little more water than grayi. But beautiful seed heads, and again, these persist for several months during the growing season, so there's a long season of interest in there. So kind of wind down with rhizomatous wetland sedges. So these species spread rapidly by rhizomes, and I consider these kind of utilitarian sedges for stormwater practices. So these are great for bioretention areas, large commercial rain gardens. They may be too aggressive for small homeowner rain gardens because they may kind of tend to take over, but these are wonderful species for stormwater applications. And they thrive in streetscape rain gardens, and they seem to exhibit pretty good salt tolerance. I've seen streetscape rain gardens where they put a variety of forbs and sedges in, and after a few winters of road salt, what's left are the sedges and the blue flag. The iris has really good salt tolerance too. So they seem to thrive in those habitats. So this one has a cool history with cultivation. So I started growing Carex stricta first, but I was actually in the early stages of the planning of Prophetstown State Park back in the 90s. I was with Jerry Wilhelm, and Jerry, we were talking about Carex stricta, and he mentioned there's a sedge along the rivers that tolerates a lot of sediment and flooding, and I think that might be good in all these stormwater ponds they're putting in everywhere, and I think it would probably do pretty well. And I took Jerry's words to heart and went and found this growing along our rivers, and actually found it to be very common along our rivers in central Indiana. I'm an avid kayaker, and I see this along every river I kayak. So this is an abundant species that probably isn't represented as well in collections. But so I took that to heart, found it, collected the seed, and grew it, and started promoting it to landscape architects that design these commercial stormwater applications. So I grew this out, and lo and behold, that was a successful marketing campaign, because suddenly I started seeing like 5,000 Carex amorii spec'd here, and 8,000 there, and 2,000 here. And by 2010 between 2010 and 2014, the leading selling plant at Spence Restoration Nursery was not prairie drop seed, it was not little blue stem or purple coneflower, it was Carex amorii. And one year I sold 45,000 Carex amorii in a single year. So if you see Carex amorii in a streetscape rain garden or a bioretention basin, that's probably descended from my foundation collection in Park County, Indiana. So that's kind of a neat story. And then another one that's good for especially wet ponds is Carex lacustris. And this one is one of the few plants that's aggressive enough to actually compete with reed canary grass, because this will really take over and spread by rhizomes. So for stormwater ponds or stormwater or wet swales, this is a great species, and it's sun or shade tolerant. It occurs in both does both in equally. Does well in equal proportions in any exposure pretty much. And it's one of our taller sedges, so the foliage in this will get about 3 feet tall. Another one that I don't have in my presentation, and like some of the other rhizomatous sedges, this one's hard to grow from seed. A lot of the Perigynia are hollow in a lot of populations, so this one's one that we've propagated vegetatively. And a closely related species that also is very robust and very competitive is Carex trichocarpa. And that one has the foliage sprays out from the culms, and the culms have a little purplish marking at the base of each leaf that makes it very distinctive and easy to identify vegetatively. So that's a great sedge as well. So I'm going to open up the floor to other species. And some of you have propagated these, and I don't have experience with most of these in cultivation. So, but I'm sure some of you have used these. So, do we have a traveling microphone? You getting that, Bill? Okay, great.
Yeah.
If you could bring it up to John, I want to ask him about one right off the bat. The top one, the Carex flacosperma. This is John Hoffman with Hoffman Nursery.
Morning, everybody.
So what's your experience with flacosperma? I don't see that in Indiana, so I don't have much experience.
Well, it's the bluest Carex we have in North Carolina. That's probably the only one. When I walk through the woods of North Carolina, it's the only one I can identify. So because it's blue, it's a foot tall or so, and it's just easy for me. So I can't identify any of the green ones. Sorry, folks, but it's an easy one. We are growing that. Actually, all right. So I need to mention this. I came up here to learn how to grow Carex from seed. Now I'm understanding that they don't produce much seed, and when I get a call from Stantec in Raleigh, and they say we need 50,000 Carex cherokeensis, it's like, okay, now what do we do? So yeah, oh yes, there's a Stantec in Raleigh. I checked that out. So we have resorted to tissue culture in some cases. Division is out there for us to do. We've had labor issues for a number of years, so we have been looking at and working with tissue culture for quite some time, especially on the Pennsylvania front. Great plant, our biggest seller when it comes to the Carex world, and it seems to work, except the year that the lab killed everything and they had on site. That didn't go over well. We had no Pennsylvania for sale that year. But they finally got it going and so anyway, that's we have looked at tissue culture, and we get several of these items from tissue culture at this point. So Pennsylvania, I think flacosperma is a seed item for us, cherokeensis seed, but Ebernia, that'll be mentioned, I think.
Yeah, you can, if you'd like to speak about that one as well.
I can, and but again, so flacosperma, just a low blue for our woods down there. It's a very pretty thing. It tends to stand out, so we're excited about that, and we've just offered it starting the past couple of years. So,
great.
Okay.
Yes. And
what is the rest of the list? Sorry, I saw another item that sclerosa. I think you all have that. We saw that yesterday.
Yeah, that's a beautiful one, and I did have some experience growing it, but I didn't have any photos of it, and I haven't ever used it in anything other than just selling a few for wetland projects.
And that's what we're doing. We get calls on occasion. We work with the landscape architects in the region. They call us for advice. We have a team in place that can help with that. We don't have all the answers, but we try to guide them. If we're out of something, we'll recommend something else if it works in that situation. So sclerosa, very nice for us, seed item, but yeah, I'm not sure. Ebernia. No, we don't do Springelii. I don't know that one.
That's all right. There's other people in the room that I think are
someone
quite
else can
familiar
do
with
that.
that one. So,
But again, we working with the Carex has been wonderful for me. I've developed an interest over the several years ago. I was talking to Cincinnati Zoo, and we wanted to find out what the best Carex are for landscape value, and as years went on, we were looking at the function also. So that's we've been pushing aesthetics and function on these plants and all of our product, grasses included, just to make sure people that we're getting the most we can out of these plants. So it's worked out very well for us, and it's been a very good marketing strategy. So we've been able to work with that. So again, the LAs, they don't understand everything about plants. So we try to help guide them, and it seems to be working pretty well. So yes.
So I have a question about Carex rosea versus radiata. My understanding about Carex rosea is that it's a little more tolerant of upland sites.
that's correct. It's more of an upland sedge. That said, in cultivation, radiata does fine in upland mesic sites. There's no problem growing radiata in upland mesic sites, but rosea is going to be better in drier soils for sure.
The beginning of the pandemic, I put in a sedge garden.
Oh, great.
Why not, right?
Yeah.
And so I ordered from a local nursery who got their plants from Midwest Ground Farmers. And what they sent me was not Carex rosea, which I ordered, but Carex radiata.
Okay.
I bought like 2 flats of it. So I was not that happy, and then it flopped. But I now, I've come to live with it, and I have the Carex rosea, it's the real Carex rosea, and I'm hoping to see how it performs. But I do want to put a plug in for Carex springelii.
Right.
It is a wonderful sedge, it's like a mid-height, it's absolutely got these beautiful drooping palms, and I absolutely love it in my landscape.
Great. Yeah. Does anyone else want to speak to Carex springalii? I think, Paul, you've cultivated it, haven't you, Paul? My only experience with that sedge is seeing it at a rest stop in Iowa in the woods in 1997. So I didn't really feel qualified to put it in the in the presentation based on that.
Right. I started it, I got a start plant, and it thrived in my front yard in semi-shade, semi-sun for many, many years. As you said, it's quite ornamental. And it does not spread, though. It's not seeded in. So that may be the limitation. You have to have a start plant to get it going. Won't self-seed. By the way, let me interject while I have the microphone. Kevin, it's a great job. I loved your presentation. Your landscape experience is really so critical to this issue. I wanted to ask, though, in Carex albicans, what would be your suggested distance for planting them in if you're trying to create that carpet, the strategy for maximizing its beauty?
So albicans, because it's a beautiful clump forming, I tend to want to space it enough so you still see the individual clumps rather than crowding it together, because the clumps have a nice form to them. So I would say probably 10 to 12 inches apart.
Good. Carex pennsylvanicum, go to John as well. I was going to recommend to also think about some of these sister taxa that might be more tolerant of maybe even drier conditions. And I'm also a little concerned about can we keep some genetic diversity even though we're doing tissue culture, to not just have only one strain, but we get multiple strains available. The third thing, if you don't see Carex timida, contact me before you leave town, and it's really easy to find on the edge of the university campus, big population. Number 4, Carex woodii, you'll have to propagate that one asexually. It never makes fertile seed. It has phony, empty achenes. Carex annectans, if you want to see that used in landscape, our local switchyard park within a mile here has both Carex vulpinoidea and annectans in a stormwater runoff area of a parking lot. And so I can direct you to find that. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. That's great insight into all those. One thing I would also mention is some of the conservative species adapt pretty readily to garden situations, and some you need to mimic their habitat a little bit. And I'll use Carex plantaginea cariana, those two species as an example, because I planted Carex plantaginea in my very fertile calcareous soil, and it was a struggle to keep it alive, actually. It likes it apparently just slightly acidic or at least based on where I see it in the wild, where it often associates with a little more acid soil on sandstone and outcrops and rich slopes on non-calcareous rock. So that one did very poorly for me and eventually faded out and died. But cariana, which did well, not surprisingly, because it grows native in the woods across the road from my property. That one seeds readily in my garden and is multiplying on its own in my garden. So keep those things in mind when you're selecting sedges for your property. Is how much is, and some are widely adaptable. Like I don't think you'd have that issue with like Carex jamesii. It'd probably adapt to a variety of soils, but some of the ones that are pretty high in the C values you may need to tailor or select ones that are most like your soil type. And and I would mention just a little bit about propagation on seed treatments. A lot of sedges, say like the Ovalles group, and fox sedge and related species, those species typically you can just store them dry, moist stratify them for 30 to 60 days, and they germinate really readily. The woodland species, especially probably the ones that are ant dispersed, have more complicated germination, and I found that some of them at least behave as recalcitrant species, that you need to harvest them and put them directly into moist stratification. So what I would do with those is harvest them, mix them with moist sterile medium, store them in my basement over the summer to kind of imitate the temperature on the forest floor. So it stayed about 65 to 70 in my basement. And then in October, I'd put them into refrigeration at 40 degrees and got excellent germination from those species under that treatment. And then there's a group with the Morii and stricta, which will germinate as soon as they fall on the ground. So those will germinate fresh, but they can also be stored over winter and moist stratified, and they work that way too, but they won't store over multiple winters. So like some of the things like vulpinoidea will remain viable for several years in refrigeration, but those in the stricta and Morii group will not. You've got 1 year to get them out of the ground, and after that they lose viability. So there's I did a heck of a lot of experimentation with seeds, because like Carex granularis, at first I got really sparse germination because I was storing it dry and then just moist stratifying it for 60 days, and I'd get one up here and there. So I started just throwing it in a bag, storing it all summer and moist, and good grief, every single seed germinated with that treatment. So it's important so there'll be a lot of experimentation with propagation on these.
I wanted to put in a word about Springelii.
Yes.
We had a highway straightening episode east of Madison, Wisconsin, and so I rescued a lot of plants, and And one of the things that I did was to dig up springalii and put some in my garden. And I'd also brought some from Madison property, and both of those populations are thriving. I think they're very slowly increasing in numbers. I think there are more there than I planted. And the nice thing about them is they put up these really bright green clumps early in the spring before the other sedges have made much of an appearance. They have a few leaves down by the ground that you don't notice. And the springalii is quite beautiful even before the perigynia come out. And I wanted to say a word about grassolescens. That's rare in Wisconsin. My late husband brought a plant from the Milwaukee area near Lake Michigan, and he planted it in the garden. And he only lived a few years after that. And during that time, the grassolescens didn't do much. And then I thought it had died out, and suddenly it began to spread out into the lawn, out away from the garden. Now I can't mow part of my lawn, but I have about 40 plants of grassolescens.
Interesting. So,
And I noticed that the staminate spike is very emergent on almost all of my plants, much more so than in the specimen that I saw here yesterday. So that's one thing when you got one population coming from one plant,
right.
you don't get the diversity that you, so I'm coming to expect the spike to be way up at the top like this, and it isn't always.
Right. Sure. Yeah.
And as for Pennsylvanica, I hear a lot of comments about Pennsylvanica in Wisconsin, where it occurs in every county, that it's weedy. We don't like Pennsylvanica. We want to eradicate it. Very strange, I think.
Yeah, that's odd to say the least. It is very vigorous in its appropriate habitat, but I wouldn't call it weedy by any stretch of the
And
imagination.
it's very elegant looking as it spreads out under
yeah.
the trees.
Yeah, it's like your dream sedge lawn. And,
Yes.
And
Excellent where your official lawn won't grow. You can try Pennsylvanica.
right. Thank you. Yeah. For those of you, some of you saw Carex picta on your field trips yesterday. If you go a little further east to the heart of the Brown County hills, we have chestnut oak forests. And talk about sedge lawns. They're just continuous cover of Carex picta, and it's quite an attractive plant community, even if it's not the most diverse plant community in the world, but the dominance of the chestnut oaks and the Carex picta make it one of the most distinctive plant communities in Indiana. So that's a really neat. If you have time to go to Brown County State Park, that plant community is really easy to find at Brown County State Park. And also walked to the restaurant via the Beeline Trail yesterday, and there's rain gardens there, and saw Carex molesta, Carex, what I think was the early growth of Carex frankii, and several others in the rain gardens there. So that was kind of neat to see, because they're probably from Spence Nursery, so it's probably some of my handiwork. So yes.
Well, I wanted to comment on a couple of things that are that bring up a topic that I was just wondering about what you thought. Quite a few years ago, before a lot of these things were available, the Arboretum and Botanical Gardens in Ann Arbor was developing a new education center, and it resulted in having a fairly steep slope, and it was right where rainwater would flush out from a cemetery, which doesn't bear too much thought, and down into a steep ravine. It was just horrible. And the director of the Botanical Gardens, who was a good friend, said, what can we do there? And my solution for him, before these things were available, was to plant Carex emorii and Trichocarpa, both of which are immediately native, right down at the bottom of the creek on the river.
Okay.
But there weren't any sources, so we crept into one of the city parks and hopped trespassed along the railroad track where they climb up the railway, and before they spray, you can get them. So
Yeah.
we managed to get enough and didn't get caught and arrested, which was good. And they were a fantastic success. But so they can just do amazing things under the most difficult of conditions. They're fantastic plants for
Right.
really terrible
Absolutely.
sites like that. But the thing I wanted to ask about in a roundabout way with that story was what kinds of thoughts are you giving to genotype separation? Do you have regional areas for Indiana? Because of course the botanical gardens wanted local. They wanted plants native right to that spot, essentially. Not always possible, but that
Right.
in many ways that's ideal.
So, yeah, I can definitely speak to that because I made all the foundation seed collections for Spence Restoration Nursery. So early in our development, I visited prairies, wetlands, and woodlands throughout Indiana and found it. And so we obviously kept track of the county and township and location of all our foundation seed collections. And in most cases, we only had a single genotype of each species. There were some very common species that we would have multiple genotypes, so we'd keep on. We had 3 different farm properties, so we'd keep them genetically separate. So like little blue stem, we had a population, a genotype from the sandy soils up by the Kankakee River, but we also had a population of little blue stem that originated in a fen in east central Indiana. So, and that one performed really well on our heavy till plain soils in east central Indiana, throughout the central part of the state, actually, more so than the stuff from the sandy soil up in northwest Indiana. So yeah, I was very cognizant of maintaining detailed records of our genotypes. And if you call Spence Restoration Nursery, you can find out what county and township everything came from. So we knew that was important from the beginning, and we actually worked with the Indiana Crop Improvement Association to get a yellow tag for the site origin, for the genetic origin for each of our species. So that is something very important in the native plant industry is to try to source things as locally as possible and appropriate to your geology and your landform, because and that's more important than distance, because for example, we're sitting here in the unglaciated part of Indiana, but the Wisconsin glaciation has stopped like 15 miles north of here, or less than that maybe even. So there you've got 2 very different habitats, and some of us saw some sedges here that drop out 15 miles north of here and you never see them again. So there's a lot of it's a very important topic in restoration for sure. Anyone else have comments?
I actually have 2 questions.
Sure.
Firstly, this is an amazing wealth of information you've provided.
Thank you.
Is there anywhere this information is consolidated in like an online resource or a book that could be available to someone who's looking for this information in terms of like the recommended propagation or growing conditions, et cetera?
So there's really good propagation information in the Prairie Moon Nursery catalog. That's one of the better sources. However, they may not have some of the details on some of the sedges, but I don't know that that's published information, to be honest with you. That's just my experience. One thing, this is being recorded, by the way, so Bill's going to make these recordings available, so you can refer back to the recording of the talk. And so if there's information that you didn't get written down, that will be available.
Great. The other question I had was, in terms of sedge lawns, are there any species that you find more resistant or more adaptable to trampling that could actually make up a native lawn?
I've seen quite a bit of foot traffic on Pennsylvanica, and it seems to tolerate a fair amount. I wouldn't put it like as it's not path rush, I'll put it that way. it's not Juncus tenuis, which is the ultimate stomp-on plant, but yeah, it seems to tolerate. And a surprising number of you probably have Carex jamesii in our lawn, which seems to tolerate a lot of mowing and abuse. If you have mature trees from a mesic woodland on your property, you probably have Carex jamesii under it, at least in the glacial till plain of Indiana. So that's one that I think would probably be pretty tolerant of foot traffic as well.
What about Carex eburnia?
I don't have enough experience with that one. I would be speaking out of ignorance there.
In Door County, Wisconsin, which is that peninsula sticking out into Lake Michigan,
Right.
it's on very calcareous rock.
Okay.
And we have a lot of white cedar swamps. And we also have white cedar growing in higher, more upland sites because of the humidity coming off the lake. And when the cedar is disturbed, cut down, other things come in, underneath the cedar, you often have mats of eburnia. Eburnia is very short,
Right.
and it makes mats, and it's neat to look at if you're a botanist, but I'm not sure that the average lawn person would get very much out of it. But it will spread out into a lawn where the trees have been removed. So it's rhizomatous, but it's a tight mat former. It doesn't have much vertical extent. So it probably is not going to be ornamental unless you are a botanist.
Right. Yep. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Kevin. It's a really incredible presentation. I really enjoy it. A couple things. I mean, Carex springeli has been covered a bunch, but I'm up in Minnesota. It's kind of the center of its distribution.
Okay.
It occurs in all of the three major biomes of Minnesota: the Laurentian mixed forest, the eastern deciduous forest, and the prairie biome. And I've had it on my property. We burn our property regularly, about 5 acres of what used to be oak savanna.
Okay.
Have it as a foundation planting, but it also is just volunteered throughout the entire property, including the edges of the gravel driveway and into the lawn. And we readily seed it into the little lawn that we have, and we mow it regularly too. And so it tolerates, I don't know that it appreciates that, but it tolerates being mown and seeded into lawn under oaks with kind of shallow soils and things like that. So I think it'd be a really excellent one to be working with for a lawn planting. Carex eburnia occurs in what we call goat prairies of the Paleozoic plateau, and it occurs under red cedar, where the red cedars come in the absence of fire,
Right.
and it will form dense mats of single species, Carex eburnia. I don't know that it would be really tolerant to foot traffic, and it certainly produces very few seeds. It's
Right.
more of a rhizomatous plant. And then lastly, I live right on the St. Croix River, which is the Minnesota-Wisconsin border, and Carex typhina is on its western edge of its range right in Minnesota. And that is one that I've seeded, collected a bunch of seed. It's a special concern species in Minnesota. Collected a bunch of seed, readily propagates, is an excellent plant for stormwater, rainwater gardens, tolerates shade, dry, really wet or temporarily inundated kind of situations, really tough sedge, and of course, very beautiful too.
Thank you for all that. I appreciate your experience with those species.
Thanks. I was just going to follow up on your question. So in addition to Kevin's presentation and the Prairie Moon website, there's also a native plant propagation database. If you Google that, you'll find that, and it's kind of hit or miss about what species are in there, and it's across the country, so that might be another source. And then internationally, there's the Seed Information Database, which also provides some germination treatments and then the results that are from those. So that's another resource. And then as another sedge with ornamental potential, this is probably like my bias for Northwest Indiana and dry grasslands speaking, but I like Carex bicknellii. It's got like those big wide perigynia. It's also a nice counterpart when you're doing planting with prairie plants. It's the cool season kind of counterpart to the warm season grasses and has a lot of nice biomass too.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, and I would add to that. So we had seed production rows of Carex bicknellii because that's often one that's used in prairie sowing. But we also had seed production rows of another ovalis, Carex brevior. That one had delightful foliage. It was really full and beautiful and extremely adaptable. That thing would grow in just about any soil and any moisture level. It was literally in the driest droughts, and then our seed nursery was kind of low and flood prone in areas, and even though that's not a wetland sedge, it'd stand in water for a week and be perfectly happy, or grow in upland dry mesic soil. So Carex brevior, I probably should have put it in here because it's just a really durable species. So that's one that I'd recommend, and has really lush, attractive foliage. Seed production rows are just beautiful, and I think one of the more attractive of the ovalis species.
Good. Thank you for getting to the ovalis, Kevin.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about Carex laxicolmus, perhaps the variety copulata, as a potential for dry shade, a plant that you might be able to install 10 inches or 12 inches on center, and it just seems to be able to coast through the part of the summer when there's no moisture in the soil but a shade. And obviously be very slow growing under those conditions. But I'd had some success with that at my property up north.
Great, great.
I did not have, though, the other variety, so I don't know how the more glaucous one would do. It might be able to tolerate more sun, but the copulata did the dense shade, which was dry.
Great, great, yeah. In fact, I didn't have a good picture of it, but I almost put laxicolmus, the blue one, in because it just has really attractive glaucous foliage. So that's a great one.
I haven't used Carex laxicolmus in the strict sense up north, but I've seen in Atlanta, Georgia, there's a cultivar called Blue Bunny. And I've seen it growing in dry mesic, partly shaded, even fairly sunny situations where it does quite well and actually reproduces by seed. And so that may be something to look into. I don't know what exactly form Blue Bunny is, but it's the glaucous form of Carex laxicolmus.
Thanks, Bill. Can we talk more about your propagation methods? Because I'm fascinated by that and want to get better at growing sedges from seed. So when you put the seeds in a moist media and put it in the basement for the summer,
Yeah.
Are you putting that in a flat and just keeping it watered? And I'm worried about mold, I guess.
Well, that's why I use a sterile medium, and I just put it in a Ziploc bag, actually. So
Okay.
It was just sealed in a Ziploc bag all summer. And I'd check it every once in a while and make sure something wasn't going horribly wrong, but
Okay.
maybe once a month. But yeah, it was, and that's how I do how I did other recalcitrant woodland species like celandine poppy and marsh marigold.
Wild ginger.
Yeah, same deal. So.
Okay, and then in the fall, pop it in the refrigerator.
Yeah, about late October. Well, we germinated things in February at the nursery, so late October would be when I would refrigerate it to give it adequate time. But if you're not germinating until April, you probably could wait till Thanksgiving or so to put it in the refrigerator.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Excellent, Kevin.
I'll put in a plug for two things. One is an interesting experience that I had with some members of Section Grizzly, and I got a few plants from a former student, Rob Noxie, and one plant has developed the interesting habit of seeding into my gravel paths, and I would say it's as resistant as path rush in dry sites to being stomped on, and it lays completely flat. But the problem is it looks kind of weird and ugly because it's clumping, so you get these little green dots scattered about the path, and you don't know whether to step from one to the other or between them, and that's Carex oligocarpa, which is entirely unexpected because it really grows in dry woods. But I have seen it in open juniper savannas on thin soil over limestone. So there might actually be some potential for that if you could ever get it to form a more even cover with a lawn. That would require, possibly even selective breeding. And then the other thing is for blue-green color and drought tolerance, for me, Carex platyphila is a wonderful plant, and it tolerates drier conditions than any of the broad-leaved woodland sedges, I think.
Right.
So.
Yeah, so if you go east to Brown County again, Carex platyphila is fairly common. It's a very conservative sedge in this area, but it's fairly common on mid-slope in very sharply drained soils, and it is a beautiful sedge. And but it seems to be mostly on non-calcareous soils here, at least in this locally, and in the Brown County hills. And it's not on extremely rich sites, but kind of dry mesic mid to upper slope sites below where the Carex picta grows, but definitely sharply drained.
One of the reasons, one of the reasons that I wanted this topic to be discussed, there's some problems. One of the problems is obviously getting material. Another problem is how do you use it? There's a big difference in horticulture with seeing a nice habit shot and having that translate to a person's yard. I think that one of the things that we could do to help with the education, and that's what I'm talking about, is to develop a database with the plants. They could be standalone shots, but they might be. I use, for example, Jamesii as an apron as opposed to mulch around the base of my trees. It's spectacular. I don't have to buy it. I don't have to do anything but enjoy it. But it's difficult for a person that does gardening. They go in the garden center, they won't be able to find it. And if they did find it, they're not going to be able to talk to a person to have that. I think if we developed a slide show and we made it commonly available, we would really help ourselves. My comment.
Okay, I would just like to close and talk a little bit about my history at Spence Restoration Nursery. So when I started at Spence Restoration Nursery, I could identify Carex grayi. Literally, that was the only sedge. My degree is in atmospheric science. I worked as a meteorologist in the Weather Service in Cincinnati for 3 years from 91 to 94. And people will call me like an autodidact, but really I've had great mentors, and many of them in this room. So Mike Moya, Jerry Wilhelm, been in the field with them, and more recently Scott Nametsnick. And so that's been just a wonderful experience all these years. So I wanted to thank everyone, but I wanted to especially talk about Paul, because my second year I quickly learned some of the wetland species, But I didn't know any of the woodland species. I had no idea what they were. And my second year at Spence Restoration Nursery, Paul took an entire day and went to Mountain State Park with me, walked around my property with me, walked through the rich woods across the road from my house with me. And I kept a little notebook, a little Write in the Rain notebook, and I taped each species in, wrote the name of it and a few distinguishing characteristics, and I still have that little Write in the Rain notebook on my bookshelf. And I'm sure many other people in this room have similar stories about what a great mentor Paul has been. So just wanted to close with that. Thank you.